countries where it grows, that like people get like that. But the question would be, so how would it transform itself?
Well, at which way with Christianity had the formation of that. I don't know what
Okay, welcome to the session on the definition of the Millennial Left by Chris Cutrone. We published in the book Marxism in the Age of Trump, which came out last month, are a series of articles about the current involvement of the left in the age of Trump. Beginning with the article Ministers and Why Not Trump. Chris published an article, The Millennial Left is Dead, a couple of months ago, and yeah, this is really teaching debate the integration of the left into the Democratic Party and liberalism more broadly. Right, so the article that this talk will be based on is for the 100th issue of the Platypus Review. So it was meant to mark 100 issues of the Platypus Review, 10 years of publication of the Platypus Review, roughly 10 years of Platypus, in fact. And so it is also the finale, rather than the epilogue. It's the finale of Marxism in the Age of Trump. So charting, in some ways, the death of the Millennial Left from the Sandinistas to the election and the aftermath of the election. So a couple of things that I wanted to say straight away, which is that the thesis was based on the American left, the American Millennial Left, but obviously has broader implications. It also refers to Corbynism, the Corbynistas, momentum, as a parallel development to the DSA in the United States. But it also reaches back from before the 2015-2016 phenomenon, namely to all the ways in which the left collapsed in the face of the economic crisis after 2008. So looking at it in a 10-year cycle, the question is, what was the opportunity of the Millennial Left? What possibilities were there for the Millennial Left? From its origins, through various different phases that we've talked about in Platypus, of activism, and then finally culminating in the last year or two of politics. Just to rehearse a little bit, part of what I chart in the article is the move from the new SDS, the refounding of the Students for a Democratic Society in 2006, to the DSA. So that's the arc. So the arc goes from the anti-war movement, the anti-Iraq war movement, to the DSA convention in 2017 that showed a phenomenal growth in the aftermath of Trump's election. In between those is, of course, Occupy Wall Street, the Occupy generation. So we have, in a sense, three different waves of millennial leftism that we have to think about. What happened to them? The anti-war movement, the anti-austerity left, which is what it was known here in the UK, but also more broadly, if you look at Syriza, if you look at Podemos, although Podemos, they're not millennials, they're older than millennials. Essentially the activism that came out of the economic crisis. And then finally the social democratic turn of more recent years. And that would be the DSA turn. Jacobin magazine as an American phenomenon, but also as an international phenomenon, figures in this narrative precisely because when
those of us in Platypus early on, when we met Bhaskar Sankara, the founder of Jacobin, and learned that he was in the DSA, we thought, how odd. Why would anyone be in the DSA? It was a kind of a fossil organization that seemed to have little or really nothing to do with the leftism of that moment, namely the anti-war movement moment. But also the Occupy Wall Street moment. In other words, the DSA also didn't have much to do with that either. So it seemed peculiar to us. It seemed like an oddity, just an accident, that Jacobin came out of the DSA. Turned out not to be so. Turned out to be more significant, actually. So I want to say some things about the DSA, since the illustration for the Millennial Left is Dead article is Michael Harrington. It is a depiction of Michael Harrington, the founder of the DSA. Because, of course, part of the argument about the death of the Millennial Left is that it's dead precisely because it's repeating something, because it's following a familiar trajectory from the past. And in that respect, of course, the DSA today both is and is not Michael Harrington's organization, the organization that Michael Harrington founded. And thinking back to when Richard and I were around the Spartacus League in college, again, the DSA would have seemed very far from any actual leftism. And indeed, were you there, Richard, when Michael Harrington spoke in the Valley, and maybe at UMass?
No, but I heard you went before that. I heard Michael Harrington speak.
You did hear him speak. You have heard him speak. Because I was at an event where, we, the Spartacists, made intervention. And he said, right, an intervention, right, intersecting, whatever. And Michael Harrington said, well, up front, I'm going to say, yes, I killed Rosa Luxemburg. Right, let's get that out of the way. Yes, I take responsibility for the murder of Rosa Luxemburg. I've heard that Bhaskar has actually said the same thing.
No.
No?
No, I've heard him say the opposite.
What did he say?
At this panel on the DSA, he was very snarky. It was just circuitous. He was like, oh, it was like somebody else got killed. It was like, we are for Rosa Luxemburg. He claimed to me.
I see. All right. I thought on Facebook he had sort of dismissed some ultra-leftists by owning social democracy. All right. So Michael Harrington is kind of an interesting figure. And of course the DSA, the founding of the DSA in the 80s, specifically, was a capitulation to the failure of the New Left. In other words, for Harrington it was a declaration of the end of a project that he had embarked upon in the 60s, namely to try to realign the Democratic Party, but from the outside. So he was a member of the Socialist Party of America, along with others such as Bayer Grustin, and they wanted the Democratic Party to become a labor and black party, but they wanted there to also be a socialist party. So the turn to the DSA in the early 80s was the abandonment of anything independent of the Democratic Party. So they had a project for realigning the Democratic Party, but that was not their principal project. That was a strategy within which the Socialist Party was supposed to be operating. So, and in fact, it wasn't...
It was also a hybrid between two impulses. So there was DSOC, which was the center.
That's later, though.
No, it was previous. There was DSOC and NAM. So it was actually a hybrid between the old, sort of the left wing of Cold War social democracy, or the left, the center left, and the sort of right sober wing of New Leftism. Right. So NAM had come out directly out of the New Left. Harrington and the others represent older generation came out of
The New American Movement, Maoist, right? DSOC, Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, Cold War Social Democrats.
Right, so it's this kind of weird mixture of like deep Jackmanism and deep malice.
You're skipping something though, which is to say, I was going to, before you interrupted me, I was going to say that this realignment strategy, of course, was not Harrington's alone, it was Max Shachtman's. And Shachtman died around the same time that the Socialist Party of America cracked up. But it was 10 years later that the DSA was founded. And so you're kind of skipping over the 70s. You're skipping over that whole...
Well, but Shachtman by this time was seen as going over to the Republicans, right? Because Shachtman's last political act was voting for Richard Nixon because he's anti-McGovern. Right?
Yeah,
So
he didn't actually. It was actually a deathbed kind of confession or something. He said,
I'm going to vote for it.
Yeah, but then he didn't. It's apocryphal.
So maybe it's apocryphal.
It wasn't a public statement.
But I mean, the interesting thing, I mean, again, it shows how like the curiosity of intersection of actual politics and sensibility is apparently before his death, like around this time, Shachtman, who is now on the far right of the Socialist Party, met with Jim Cannon. So these two men of like the same generation.
The Trotskyists.
Right, Trotskyists who've been political. So there was still like this kind of like meeting this political enemy, but whom he felt he had something in common with, even though they'd completely gone separate ways. So I think that like when one thinks about these things, one has to think about multiple dimensions. One has to think about an actual political dimension, but one also has to think about the question of sensibility, right? And the post sort of 72, right? In other words, because of McGovern, the Democratic Party could then seem like, okay, it's a different thing, even though it wasn't, to a bunch of new leftists, basically.
Maybe I would make the opposite point,
Yeah.
which is that McGovern was the evidence that the realignment strategy for the Democrats had completely failed. In other words, that in many respects the worst aspects of the New Left had won out, as opposed to the early New Left impulse, right? So, anyway, the repetition on the part of the Millennial Left took less than 10 years. What the DSA originally came out of, which was a cycle of more than 20 years. In other words, if you go from the Port Huron statement to the founding of the DSA, if you go from the old SDS to the DSA, as opposed to the new SDS to the DSA, you have a much more compressed history. However, we could say a lot of that history was repeated within it, meaning the shift from the anti-war movement to the economic crisis that also happened, 68, which we're going to be talking about, was very much colored by Vietnam, but that was eclipsed in the 70s by the crisis of 73 and the downturn, which really gave an opportunity for neoliberalism that no one saw coming, right? In the same way that, of course, no one saw Trump coming. But earlier on, no one really believed Reagan was coming either. Right? So the DSA, the founding of the DSA was colored by the surprise victory of Reagan. Reagan wasn't quite as unlikely a figure as Trump, but he was an unlikely figure. For instance, Herbert Marcuse, who died in the late 70s, he said that only a fascist would call for what Reagan was calling for, the cutting of the welfare state. And that freedom of speech should not extend so far as to permit people to call for cutting the welfare state. He said, only fascists, and we shouldn't give free speech to fascists. Marcuse, right? Who should have known better? But anyway, it was a little bit of new leftism. In other words, for Marcuse, the only thing that could come in capitalism from the Fordist Keynesian welfare state, the only change that could happen would be for the worse and would be fascism, which is a funny mirror image to the way the neoliberals themselves treat socialism. Namely, the neoliberals treated socialism as a form of fascism. So I say all of this just to point out that the vicissitudes of the New Left, where it started, where it ended up going, and where it ended up, that this is the experience of the millennial generation as well. And that's why the article starts with the millennial left has been subject to the triple knockout of Obama, Sanders, and Trump. Right? And so we have to remember what they represent. So Obama represented an anti-war candidate, who of course was not. He also represented a New Deal candidate, which of course he was not. Right? He represented all of these things. Now of course Sanders is the reprise, right? In other words, Sanders is, no, he's the real anti-war candidate. No, he's really the New Deal candidate. Right? So, and then of course Trump, who was also against the war. Don't let the liberals lie to you about that. He just made a speech recently talking about the amount of money spent by the United States in the Middle East, including Afghanistan, which is not the Middle East. But anyway, he said it was the worst mistake the United States ever made. He's also not a neoliberal. He's also
The
not a
mistake is
neoliberal.
Iraq, or I mean the whole.
Afghanistan, everything. Everything. He wanted to pull out of Afghanistan too, but the generals convinced him not to.
I mean, the other parallel with Reagan would be that Reagan's ascent coincided with the ascent of the New Left. Right? It's the same.
Which ascent though? You mean as
It's
governor of
political,
California?
As governor of California.
Governor of
And
California.
then, right. So I mean, one of the it's one of the questions one has to ask in terms of this narrative is Reagan as a phenomenon of conservatism is also a product of the same historical moment.
The new right.
Right.
The new right and the new left are parallel phenomena. Now the new right, now of course, you know, one of the things that we emphasize in Platypus is that the right is by definition incoherent, meaning the new right is all different things. It's neoconservatism, and actually there are different flavors of neoconservatism. There's the William F. Buckley neoconservatism, but then there's also Daniel Bell neoconservatism, and then finally, who would you make the exemplar of, like?
The Pat Buchanan paleoconservatism?
No, neoconservatism.
Neoconservatism?
Like the Leo Straussians, like the you know, the hawkish, huh?
Oh,
Yeah, like, and they're not all the same thing. So you have neoconservatives of various flavors, some emphasizing Cold War foreign policy and American hegemony, some representing cultural conservatism, some representing political conservatism, but not paleoconservatism. That would be like a William F. Buckley. And the neoliberals, who are more one thing, but also not just one thing, because there were Republican neoliberals and Democratic Party neoliberals. So the new right, as a parallel to the new left, of course, people have tried to turn the Trump moment into a new right, the alt-right, right? So the millennial left has its doppelganger, and that's the alt-right. But it turns out that, well, first of all, the millennial left isn't a new left, and it turns out that the alt-right is really just a paper tiger, or a meme, or I don't know what you'd call it. A meme frog? Not a paper tiger, but a meme frog. So, you know, we wish that it had this kind of more direct parallel, but it doesn't. My point with Reagan and Trump was to say that in the 70s, the left tried to give up mere protest politics and become more political, but they were sidelined by Reagan's election. And I think something similar happened with the millennial left, which is that they lowered their ambitions. They seemed to get more, you know, if you recall Occupy Wall Street, the idea that they were going to move from these spectacular occupations to working in communities. Do you remember that term that took place?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Something similar happened in the 70s with the New Left. And, again, they were shocked by what really happened, which is that the working class voted for Reagan. In other words, they proletarianized, they went to the workers, and they were betrayed by the working class. And something similar is happening around the Bernie Bros, Sandinista, socialist, Trump moment. This is all to say, why would I say that the Millennial Left is dead? Because nothing new about it has really survived. Right? Because of course it's not dead, meaning it still exists, and it probably has a glorious future. I had a dream last year, I'm looking at you, Pam, because Bhaskar was running for president. It was 20 years later. It was 20 years later. Bhaskar was running for president as a Democrat, and Pam was accosting me, Chris, how did we let this happen? And I said, I've been saying it all along. Right? No, it'll be Bhaskar, and he'll be a Democrat, and who knows what the Democratic Party will be at that point. It will be as different a Bhaskar as Hillary was from her 1972 self, meaning not at all different, and yet quite different.
But another formulation that connects to that you said, I think it was Oldham and Paul, to the members, was that Bhaskar will be 20 years down the road, and 30 years down the road, still talking about the Bernie Sanders moment. There'll be nostalgia about the Sanders moment.
Well, there's nostalgia for the McGovern moment.
There's nostalgia for Occupy.
There's nostalgia for Occupy. There's, of course, nostalgia for the anti-war movement, but in a different sense. Again, the anti-war movement, because it's protest politics, because it's single-issueism, because the new SDS was aware of the limitations of that. I do think that Occupy Wall Street, the anti-austerity movement in Europe, but in the UK in particular. So if you look at momentum, and you look at the Corbynistas, if you look at someone like Richard Seymour, who of course is a big hater of Platypus, who went from anti-war to anti-austerity, both under the rubric of Cliffism, of the Socialist Workers' Party, but then broke with the Socialist Workers' Party over the sex scandal, but really the sex scandal just happened opportunely, because what had happened was that the wave of protests had waned, and these activists really had nothing to do, and so they suddenly woke up and realized that the organization that they were part of was rotten and bureaucratic and unprincipled. But the sex scandal was just an excuse, really, for abandoning the SWP and for rejoining labor. Yeah.
One question. What about the period from the 80s to like the founding of Platypus?
From
the you talked about the New Left till the 80s and the founding of the DSA, and now the repetition. And what does this period maybe tell us about our prospects for the future?
Gen X.
Anti-globalization.
Yes.
Gen X. No, I mean, you don't want to be Gen X. Gen X is Gen X for a reason. There's an X for a reason. It's the lost generation. Right? It's the generation that's neither boomer nor millennial. They're the burnouts, the stoners, the whatevers. Although they also supply the cadre for a lot of organizations, for the ISO.
They were there in Occupy though.
They were?
There. Oh yeah. Well, we had
Well, they were the
Lena
ones
speak
advocates
on
do.
our Occupy panel at the platform. And she was like, we were there, we were teaching the kids how to communicate, the hand signals were ours, we learned
David
the
Graeber.
What's the last
Graeber is
panel?
David Graeber was Gen
Yeah.
X.
Yeah.
Speaking of which,
Yeah.
no longer at Goldsmiths.
No,
LSE. So he follows Platypus.
I may have somewhat of a disagreement or difference of emphasis, but it seems to me that one of the fundamental things that happened was the collapse of Stalinism. And it's a fundamental thing.
I knew, see, as soon as you said 80s, I said, No, Richard, please, no 1989, please.
Well,
please,
the thing,
please,
but the strange thing about 1989 is actually that it did not really register in people consciously. I think its effects have been unconscious and have been delayed. And I think
They were conscious. I remember people saying, okay, Marxism instead.
right, but 1989 allowed.
Leftists.
So I think two things happened. One, there was a kind of neoliberal turn starting in the Anglo-American world, like late 70s, the Thatcher Reagan.
All right, let me rescue this.
And
Let me rescue this. Go ahead.
But I think that you know, when there was the discussion with Gregor on the list and talking about the most
People resisted Reagan until '89, and then it became superfluous. Meaning, and of course Reagan was out of office. George Herbert Walker Bush was elected.
and the real ravages of neoliberalism, for example, in the United States, came not under the Republicans, but under Bill Clinton.
Ravages or success?
Or successes. Well,
The success of
but
neoliberalism.
in that
The
sense,
ravages of neoliberalism are, of course, now.
okay, the ravages, but in terms of, for example, it was not Reagan who really dismantled welfare as we know.
Right.
It was not
Clinton.
Bush the first,
Right.
it was Bill Clinton. And that was itself, in many respects, one of the aspects of Bill
Can I
Clinton.
say why not Trump? Let me say something about why not Trump. Why I pushed it the way that I did, when I did, was that, of course, I was thinking 8 years down the road. Meaning, who's going to be the Democrat who gets elected after Trump in 2024? Right. That's going to be when the significance of this moment really hits home. The Reagan Revolution was significant, of course, in its own moment, but people resisted it and denied it for a long time. And then, you know, Clinton basically, you know, it's like Tony Blair with Margaret Thatcher. It appears to be redundant. In other words, resisting Reaganism, resisting Thatcherism is redundant. That you get a kind of new progressivism that actually takes on board neoliberalism.
I guess I was still shocked about the comment Efraim made about the acid Corbynism.
Acid Corbynism.
That is actually so that it's actually not meant seriously. And,
Well, how could it be? Acid. So we have to really remember our 60s.
But more broadly about the Millennial Left, is it really that Millennial Left is just a repetition of the ideas and tactics and bits and pieces of the new left? And will that continue forever?
Good question. Well, it's a repetition with a difference. Meaning, really the point of my article, which someone on Facebook called sublimated spleen. So spleen means depression. So it's sublimated spleen, and then someone else called the Why Not Trump article sublimated rage. Right. So mourning the loss of the millennials. You're dead to me. Right, like that kind of a move. The Millennial Left started out trying not to repeat the 60s, trying to get past the 60s. And 2008, as opposed to 2018, it looked like that was possible. In other words, the 40-year anniversary of 1968 looked very different than the 50th anniversary looks. The 50th anniversary doesn't really bring 68 into contention. It naturalizes it. The 40-year anniversary of 68 actually raised the issues again. That was also in the form of Obama, who was given his political start in the home of Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers, right? He said, this is the leader of a new generation. And of course, Obama's Generation X. And if you recall, Hillary Clinton, but also Bill Clinton, their criticism of Obama was that he was too young to understand what was wrong with Reaganism. In other words, he took Reaganism for granted, whereas they knew what they were fighting against, and Obama didn't, that he was essentially a Reaganite, precisely because he was Generation X. So bringing it back around to the 80s, because I do think this question is important. What happened between Generation X and the Millennial Left? Well, the 90s left. It's not really the 80s left, it's the 90s left. The 80s left was Central American solidarity, it was other things. It was actually an extension of the 70s in many respects. The 90s, however, anti-globalization, that is a shift. There is a little bit of a turn there. And of course that's the Generation X that has more of an immediate impact on the millennials, I think.
There's one aspect of the 80s left that has been naturalized, which is the basically the development of an activist left and an academic left, and the abandonment by both of really revolutionary politics, except for certain minimal sectarians. So essentially, you have like some sense that ultimately we want a revolution, but there's a kind of division of labor and theorists who theorize some kind of resistance, and then people who do stuff but don't think too much about it.
Well, unfortunately, they do think a lot about it, but it's sophistry. Right? It's not as if the ISO doesn't have a theory.
Well, the ISO is still the older, but I'm thinking more about the non-sectarian.
Oh, I see.
The non-sectarian academic leftism. So, what well, it's also the triumph of postmodernism in academia is in the 80s. So, like, what the academic left looks like today is largely a product of something that happened in the 80s. Before the 80s, the academic left looked different.
Oh, certainly.
But that's something that is, again, it has to be emphasized because it's something that's been natural. In other words, now it seems so natural that it should be that.
So the right, of course, claims that the university has been taken over by the left. But what really happened was that the left liquidated itself in academicism. Meaning, this is not some nefarious plot on the part of leftists. So cultural Marxism, like, is this an alt-right meme? Right, the cultural Marxism idea. Frankfurt School had this program for like undermining Western civilization, and that's what these academics are doing. That's what Judith Butler's all about. Right?
She received you a Nobel Prize.
Well, yeah. And they would say, and this shows that the conspiracy is continuing. But of course, we would emphasize the exact opposite point, which is that it's not that the university became new leftist. It's that the new left liquidated itself. And again, in the 40th anniversary of '68, Ben Blumberg wrote his article citing Daniel Cohn-Bendit saying that we won culturally and socially, but lost politically, thank God. Right? But to say we won culturally and socially, I'm not sure what he meant by that, though. That's questionable, but now politically, of course, means not at all, right? Because to win culturally but not politically, that's nothing, right? That's just to change the cultural appearance of capitalism, right? Which then becomes politics, right? To say cultural politics, there's no such thing as cultural politics. Cultural politics is the death of politics. And that's where we are now, by the way.
Yeah.
That's where we are now. And that's maybe the last point that I'd like to emphasize about the death of the millennial left, is that if we date neoliberalism in a twofold way, from '73, but also from '89, then of course the neoliberalism that is in crisis now is the post-'89 neoliberalism. It's the neoliberalism that the 90s left and the millennial left thought of itself as opposing, which they are now going to defend. In other words, they're not going to defend Reagan They're not going to defend Friedrich Hayek. They're not going to defend Milton Friedman. But they're going to defend Clintonism. In other words, they're going to defend the ultimate result of all of that. They're going to defend, in the UK, they're going to defend Blairism, ultimately.
We had that.
Well, last night.
Very much last
Yeah.
night.
And so that's the imperceptible, that's the reversal that somehow is imperceptible to people. In other words, that the people who do that themselves are completely unaware of what they've done. That repeats a New Left experience as well, which is the way they attacked the welfare state and then became its defenders in the neoliberal era. So what we're going to have now is that the left's going to be the rear guard of what's fading, namely a specific kind of neoliberal politics, specifically of the Democratic Party. And as I point out, and maybe not just the Democratic Party, meaning that you'll find arguments for why the mainstream Republicans aren't so bad next to Trump. Right? Paul Ryan, right? So if you recall, he's the Speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States. So in some ways, the second most powerful politician, actually, next to the president.
More than the VP.
Huh?
More than the VP, of course.
No, the VP is nothing. Yeah, he'd be prime minister in the UK, absolutely. So Paul Ryan, was of course very anti-Trump, and is an '80s, Reaganite, in Generation X, my age, etc. He condemned Trump for what he called a textbook example of racism, like during the campaign, textbook example of racism, which I thought the irony of that is lost on people. Meaning, what Paul Ryan was saying was, when I was in school, I was taught, you shouldn't talk that way because it's racist. So Trump just talked that way, and so it's a textbook example of racism. Meaning, of course, Paul Ryan is the same neoliberal identity politics person as Hillary Clinton. They all are. But it's precisely that the left's going to try to defend, even as mainstream politics abandons it. Which they will. They're not right now, but by 7 years from now, we're going to be wondering what all of this stuff was about. The first year of the Trump presidency and all this resistance stuff. So that reversal, that to the participants is imperceptible. Why was it important to declare after 10 years Millennial Left is dead to try to make history perceptible? One of the things that Platypus exists for is to actually feel the texture of historical change in our own time. And this is a difference between Richard and myself, which is to say that Richard emphasizes continuity and I emphasize change, meaning Richard emphasizes it's still capitalism, it's still the same old thing, it's still whatever, whereas I, to his mind, overemphasize the nuances of change. The nuances of change, but still, there's change. And the reason that we have to be aware of change is that, of course, we're always changing. It's not as if you can hold the same idea for 10 years without that actually changing. It's actually a different idea. Holding the same idea 10 years later is actually holding a different idea. And that's what needed to be marked. Right? So the most significant thing for me about the Trump election was the death of the Millennial Left. In the same way that the most significant thing for me about the Sanders candidacy was the death of the Millennial Left. The left-centric view of history. David.
Forgive me if this isn't a question specifically about the Millennial Left, but I'm just wondering, to what extent is there perhaps a value in listening to the paranoia coming from the right about the left? Maybe it's not the Millennial Left, but like a kind of new totalitarian and censorship and...
Which right?
So I guess the right I'm thinking of is kind of like a sort of tech libertarianism.
Spiked.
No, well...
Yeah, they're part of that.
Okay. So yeah, okay, I didn't think of the spike when I was thinking of this. I was thinking of like self-consciously
Oh yeah.
libertarian.
You mean self-consciously right-wing?
Yeah, not like
About
alt-right, but yeah. So this like this anxiety about censorship and about lack of free, like the loss of the value of free speech. And also, are they the millennial left, their object of anxiety, or is this like a post-millennial left?
Oh no, I think it's bound up with the same moment. You mean are younger people, post-millennials, now complaining about the millennials as a totalitarian authority? That has yet to happen.
But I mean, in the article and also here, you emphasize like one direction of the left, of the millennial left, which is the
Social democracy.
Yeah, social democracy. And there's obviously the other side, which Michael Harrington always warned about, namely the sectarianism. And
I don't know if sectarianism has much of a future. No new Marxist organizations have been produced by the Millennial Left, except Platypus, right? So we are the ultra-sectarian anti-sectarians, meaning part of what we have to do in even having such a thing as Platypus is to call attention to the pitfalls of such formations. In other words, we're critical sectarians, right? So that's the point, is to recognize that to be sectarian now, in the way that we obviously are, is also to represent the death of the old sectarian left. Because the old sectarian left was sectarian by default, not by design. Platypus is sectarian by design, right? In a way that none of what we would call disparaging of the sectarian left, none of them intended to be sects, not at all. Whereas we took on that pitfall deliberately and self-consciously.
They're all failed mass organizations.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but
And they're self-conception.
well, they didn't necessarily aim to be immediately mass organizations, but that brings up the 70s, which is the deep stuff out.
So when you say the millennial left is dead, that implies that at some point it was also alive.
Yeah, in 2006, when Platypus was born too.
Yeah, well, I mean, but that I guess was my question. Like, at which point was it alive? Is it just Platypus? Because living through those 10 years, I never felt like it was alive.
And yet, here we are. Yeah, there was a possibility. I mean, you could say that the millennial left was stillborn. You could say that the new left was stillborn. You could say that they never overcame their initial problem, which is how to take up the struggle for socialism and not be anti-communists or communists. Yeah, they never did really. They tried. Yeah.
Was the millennial left ever aspiring to be socialist? I'm not sure.
I aspired to overthrow capitalism.
Well, but they were not saying that they were socialists.
But like the USDS, right? Like what happened in the USDS, where you had like the Maoists, and then you had like the Red Baiters.
Yeah, the anarchists.
And there was a way that like they tried to work together.
Yeah.
And yet when you were in the room with them, and they would have like, what are we gonna do? It just all fell back into you were not doing enough by the Maoists, and you're not revolutionary enough, and then the red baiting would come out of these like social democrats that consider themselves to be radical, and they would fall back on these liberal tropes. And so when we were in New York at the Left Forum, and before Obama was like going to become president, and we were like,
non-ideological.
We were like, okay, so what are we going to do? How are we going to protest the Obama election? You know, the liberals in the SDS, which were the political leadership of the SDS, were like, well, we can't protest Obama because he's black and he'll be the first black president. And then the Maoists were like, well, fuck this, and they chanted Ho Chi Minh in another room. And it was like, okay, like, what do we do with
But if
that?
anything, something that did unite them was, like, meaning, I guess, at least they would all say yes to socialism. Like that might have been the only thing, I mean,
I don't think that Rachel woman would have said yes to socialism.
She would, absolutely.
You think?
Socialism meant something different then than it
Exactly.
does now. That's one of the changes that we have to mark in the decade.
In the Sanders form of socialism, she would have said yes.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a kind of historical, like, accident, whatever, but today is the 15th anniversary of the million-person march against the Iraq War in London. So when was the Millennial Left alive and when is it dead?
Right.
There was this book out about the 2010 student protests in London, which
The anti-austerity.
the anti-austerity stuff, which basically positioned itself as an oral history of the protests, right, all this stuff, because it's radical to like tell the history from the ground, and it positioned itself as not only surpassing 2003 to 6, but surpassing the New Left in the UK
Yeah.
in terms of protest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting how Chris and Richard tell the history of these two arcs in terms of
There was an aspiration to outdo the New Left and to surpass it, to transcend it. And now I think the millennials are like, the best we can do, the best we could possibly do would be to repeat the New Left.
but that they will tell the history in terms of these protests,
Yeah.
not in terms of politics.
Right.
And so something like this presentation and this
You
assessment.
mean the retrospective view,
Retrospective
the
view.
rear guard view?
Yeah.
Because, of course, Occupy also was not trying to be a mere protest, right? They resisted that. They said that was like slander, right? Because what they were trying to do was create democracy.
Create the new society.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned the 15-year anniversary. So during the 80s in the United States, there were steady protests, not respectable, but not huge, against like Central American intervention, which were of course pro-democratic in the United States.
Which we attended.
Yeah, and then there were protests against the first Gulf War,
Yeah.
which were pretty big.
Yeah.
But that was over quickly. I remember like the protests of like 15 years ago, the huge ones. And those were really, really big. They were as big as Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And the size of the protests made people feel, or deluded people into feeling, that something important was happening. But what's striking is how quickly the anti-war movement disappeared. There is no anti-war movement. I mean, there may be like a few people who like do something, but basically nothing has happened for years. And what
There were two moments of the anti-Iraq war movement. There was the pre-war, and then there was the dark days of the war, 2006. Right, so there were people who tried to protest, who tried to stop the war from happening. And then there were people who tried to take advantage of the fact that the war was a debacle, which didn't fully manifest until 2006.
Right. And what really
And those are two different.
And what completely killed the anti-war movement, like definitively, was the election of Obama, because nothing changed. I mean, fundamentally, whatever. And from then on, everything became just a kind of technical question about military planning. And what's striking now, in terms of like the concept of an anti-war movement, is that people now just accept that the United States is going to be permanently at war. I mean, in the general public. I mean, normal people.
I see. You
Normal
mean that you're not going to have a repeat of the 2003 moment.
And
Right.
I think that consciousness has sunk into the left, right? And other people who are coming of age now and going to college, they don't remember the U.S. being at, quote, peace, whatever that means. In other words, some kind of war in the Middle East is normal,
Yes.
right? And that's just seen as part of life. So in that context, an anti-war movement just becomes sort of one more protest against the bad aspects.
So the new STS aspired because they, engaged that moment of the doldrums of the war 2006, and they were very aware of the fact that being tied to the anti-war movement too much was a liability and could prove fatal, and it turned out to be the case. But they did try to reinvent themselves around the economic crisis.
But the causes of today are things like Me Too and Black Lives Matter.
Causes?
Well, I mean, things that people would see as left and the resistance. Even people on the left don't mention the anti-war movement.
But alongside that, there's just something Chris said, there's the change, for example, with the SWP people, the change in their relationship to Jeremy Corbyn, because of course Corbyn was the big speaker, or one of the big speakers in 2006, and the relationship then was like, oh yeah, Jeremy's our friend, who's going to speak at this big protest that we're organising.
Right.
And now it's like, he's both completed that movement and just deleted it all. So it's no longer that they're on different sides but working together for the protest.
Right, he would have been an ornamental figure of the anti-war movement, whereas now he's the leader of the Labour Party.
I mean, by the nature of the comments now, we emphasize the aspect of the possibility of the millennial, but I think we also should sort of have to take in consideration that there was no possibility at all for the millennial.
That's quite possible.
To start with. And
it's quite possible that Marxism never had any possibilities either.
So that raises the question whether Platypus was offline long ago talking about it.
Well, actually the question is, was Platypus a mistake? In other words, I can tell you that when I was in Chicago in the summer of 2006 and we were doing the reading group here in Chicago, already, but Sunit and Spencer were in London for Marxism 2006, and they were writing me furious emails. Chris, you finally have to write the manifesto of Platypus. And so I banged it out, right? Because they were like, because we need to stop this, right? And Laurie and Pam, right, we formatted it as the trifold, remember, so that they could hand it out.
We were both design students helping figure out the best way to
And Dakota was like, who's the we?
Yeah,
was like, ah, shit.
No, that was anarchism right there.
Yeah.
That was like Max Stirner or something. That was like the ego in its own or something. Who's this we? So, of course, Platypus was based on the idea that there was a possibility. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered. I would not have bothered. I would not have bothered. I was happy to be distant from the left. I was happy to just teach and, have a kind of ironic smile about Marxism in the classroom. Or to say, oh, well, do we still live in capitalism? I was willing to leave it at I was willing to leave it at the level of Adorno in 1969. I was willing to just leave it right there. Right, so...
Well, I think I'm going to ask what's probably the obvious follow-up to what was just said, which is, okay, the whole reason to do Platypus was because we thought there was a potential Millennial Left, and now we're saying the Millennial Left is dead. Where does that leave us? I mean, it's not obvious yet what the potentials will or won't be of a...
So I thought about ending my article with something like the postscript of the Sandinistas, which is, the future of people struggling for socialism will be found among people who voted for Trump, as also, right? Something like that. Like, I thought about ending it on a post-millennial, kind of like, okay, exit the stage millennials, go to the dustbin of history, now it's time for the post-millennials. But I just thought, nah, we'll just see about that.
Yeah,
Too early to tell.
It's way too early, Sebastian.
Yeah, maybe just short follow-up on her question is like how, I'm interested in the transition of this experience of the millennial left. Like, how can we tell younger people like what's the significance after the repeat of like the 30s, the 60s, and now the millennial left? Like, how much of significance is that at all? Like, why should we not like teach the 30s and 60s and like? Yeah, or
Well,
like it's because people are more and more like more interested in like they don't know why the millennial left is of importance anymore.
Yeah, I think if the millennial left is that raises the question why we focus on the left.
All right. So here's the thing, because there are a few moments in the history of Platypus that are distinct. Because I can say that being at the new SDS founding convention in 2006, held at the University of Chicago, going there with some of the early people in Platypus to observe, I thought, okay, this could be something. I also felt that way about Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
I also felt that way.
Definitely
Yeah. And
We were in there.
did. We ran around.
No, but there was a lot of
resistance. There was resistance to Occupy Wall Street.
Chicago kind of, like, there was a no, we're not going moment too.
Right,
There
maybe
was.
that's the one.
New York was different, but I mean, anyway, it was different.
But I remember Spencer and I going to the Occupy Wall Street stuff in Chicago and thinking, this is a mess. And of course I had a criticism of it, but I still thought it could be something. That's not going on now. That's not going on now. In other words, the Sandinistas movement was not a moment like that.
Did that?
Yeah,
Sebastian.
maybe to clarify, but also like
Mhm.
this, because the Generation X's were in a way different from the generations before on the left. It seems so.
Okay,
so
right.
and younger, there's sometimes some curiosity when I speak to younger people, but also there's the flip side to it that why does it even why?
All right, so that gets to another point with respect to Platypus, which is to say, why did I feel motivated to do Platypus in a way that I had not been previously motivated to do any such thing? To save the millennials from my generation. Right, I just thought, well, there's one thing I can do. Right, I can stop my generation. Well, it turns out, no, I couldn't even do that. Right. But for, really. And I thought Platypus was based on actually the second wind of the 60s. Meaning the second wind of the 60s was telling the millennials, don't do what we did. Whereas my generation would say, there's nothing to be done other than what they did. But of course, what my generation means about what the 60s did is not actually what the 60s did. It's the 80s version. It's what we were talking about earlier about activism and academicism. Of course, the roots of that are in the 60s, but it was not that. In other words, institutionalized activism, institutionalized academicism, organizations that only exist to organize protest demos. No, that's not what the 60s were. It's not. It became clear by 68, because there's a turn. 68 is a turn in the New Left. Adorno marks it. He says something changed, right? In other words, it first looked like the student movement was actually doing something, but now they just want to protest. Right? He says that to Marcuse. He says we can't fail to observe the change.
Something that's coming up is like this Platypus mistake. There was a question posed, but something I recently read the 2010 President's Report.
The one that's circulated as part of the anti-Platypus slander.
Which is,
Because of course I said it, but of course I didn't say it. No. It's a basic truth that if you say one thing to one person, you're not saying it to another person. Meaning, what I say to members of Platypus, I'm not saying to anyone else. And so once it's taken out of that context, I didn't say it.
But so I wanted to, call attention to this formulation you had of Platypus having a first political moment in its foundation. And I'm wondering if that relates to this possibility in the Millennial Left. You said they won't have a second political moment until its project has been realized.
Right. Well, right. So in other words, Platypus was meant to expire. And so the best we can do now is recognize its expiration. Right? Second decade of Platypus means that it's something different.
I would, it seems to me that, I guess I was both less optimistic than Chris and then less pessimistic now.
Exactly.
So I've been more even-keeled about
It's not that you've been even-keeled, it's that you didn't have any
I had no
expectations to
begin
disappoint.
with.
And that's very different.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I just started with low expectations. So I think that the real problem we face is not the problem of repetition, but actually the problem with the repetition is on a kind of ever more less coherent level. And the problem for Platypus, as opposed to just the human species in general, which is the real problem.
The human species?
Well, just dealing with us.
What about the monitoring species?
Is that there's a tension in terms of the project of preserving historical memory. And that as one keeps on keeping on preserving historical memory, there's a process of potential deterioration.
There's a definite.
And so one of the advantages, so to speak, of like the earlier generations, or particularly the New Left generation, had over subsequent generations of kind of New Leftism of the second half of the 20th century, is that it was closer to certain historical experiences, right? I mean, and I think what we are threatened with is the problem of how do you explain Marxism to people who have no historical experience, and therefore have to take a narrative about historical experience. Historical experience that is not within our living memory, or perhaps within any living human being's memory. How do you convey that and make it real to people, and how do people feel that they can grasp that?
Here's a parable. So we wrote on the dry erase board at Pam and Laurie's apartment. Right?
Yeah, 2017 World Revolution.
2017 World Revolution. So we actually had like a pretty well thought out vision of what that was going to be.
That was like Marco drunk.
No, but that was Goodbye Ladies, right? That was the part underneath Goodbye Ladies. That was Marco drunk.
But that was the call of the first convention, was 2017. World Revolution.
Right, but so what was our image of that? Our image of that was Sarah Palin will be elected president, but the revolution will break out before she can be inaugurated. And that's exactly what happened.
Well,
except
we thought we were going to
something very different.
That was like the vision.
Right.
Inspiration.
But
right, that we weren't going to be around.
let me say something about the second decade, since I brought that up. Second decade of Platypus, we do have to get back to basics, meaning we do have to reinscribe our original point of departure, precisely because now it's something different. So to say, was Platypus a mistake? It's kind of like, I raised that in order to, the usual way people think of historical experience is you learn from your mistakes, right? Trial and error. And of course, we have a completely different way of looking at history that we need to bear in mind. Which is to say, we could say, oh, well, we thought the Millennial Left would have been something, but then we learned, we figured out why it was fatally flawed from the beginning and why it couldn't have been anything and blah, 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 right? That would be the path of sectarianism, simple sectarianism. Meaning that, the Spartacists in the 60s said, no one's a Trotskyist, and so this isn't going anywhere. but they also acted differently than they ended up acting in the 80s. In other words, they said the same thing. People are rejecting Trotskyism, therefore it can't go anywhere. But they actually meant something different by it in the 60s and in the 70s in the heat of their moment, and versus their fossilized version of themselves. Right? In other words, they didn't change, but by not changing, they did change, in fact. Ian?
Oh, I was going to just say that, and I don't know if this is the same everywhere, but I sort of noticed this, is that it would appear that the millennial left is also important because it's going to be the inheritor of the new left generation institutions, essentially, that were built by the new left. And you see that like in the, basically Jackman is going to take first, I'm sure. That's the trajectory there or whatever. But that's the case in lots of like small like activist-y things. I'm sure there's lots of examples from different areas. So the millennial left does kind of have an important
future
role in that sense. And it is also interesting that the millennial left is least interested in the new left. In some sense.
What do you mean least interested?
Like I don't think they'll have events on like 50 years of 1968 that are that like significant. I don't think that's that important to them. I think they were more interested probably in the 1917 type stuff. I think they think of New Left as like, meh.
Except Jacqueline published a meh article on anti-fascism.
Well, I mean, there's lots of people who are interested in every historical theory.
No, it will be interesting to see. Right, that's right. So, whereas at the beginning, the millennial left was very much concerned with the 60s. Much more so, yeah. And whereas now it's kind of like, there's nothing, it's not that they're not interested in the 60s, it's that they're not critically interested, they're not reconsidering it.
They're not motivated by it.
Right. They don't feel like it's an unfinished task in quite the same way that it looked in 2006, 2007, 2008.
And I guess we share that a little bit. And so there is a general, like, it seems like there's an interest in earlier. There's also
There might be a reversal, though, which is to say that we might have started out much more anti-60s, much more cynical about the 60s, and we might end up being the ones who say actually there was a possibility in the 60s that now is being kind of analyzed and erased.
Because we also like engaged the 60s,
Yeah.
which I miss because it was a better conversation.
It was.
Than now because those people had a deeper sense of the problem. They also just cared more about the problem on a certain level. But I do feel it's been analyzed, I guess, which gives purchase to the earlier history, but in a more crude new left narrative.
Absolutely, it's been like turned into a posterized version of itself. Yeah.
So something that came up last night, and actually it's something that the DSAers bring up, is the 70s. So last night, Robert, who left earlier, he apologized to the generation, and then he was like, well, we tried, like, we got people into the workplaces, right? And we tried to get back in there, and Chris Maisano, who is an editor at Jacobin and does stuff at DSA, like, he will write his articles and like talk to people about the labor radicalism of the 70s as like a high point, right? And so it's like the superseding of the 60s or something. But part of me is like deeply confused about what happened in the 1970s and wonder if we should, as we were talking earlier in our internal panel, that the 60s for us might be like, maybe we need to like start consciously thinking about a process of forgetting that's like productive of the new left generation, and what it might mean to learn what the 1970s was for the left. I don't know. I just like
it's tricky because the 70s are important in a way that's usually neglected, but there is also a diminution from the 60s to the 70s. In other words, the 60s generation are right to celebrate their early naive heroism and deprecate their political turn of the 70s. They are right about that.
Right, but I'm curious again, like if people
Lowering
like
of ambition.
Robert from the RCP, right? And like, this is not the first person who said this. Like they find like they themselves work through a problem by getting back to the workers or something. And obviously, I don't think that us like dealing with the 70s in our syllabus or something would mean to endorse it, obviously.
No,
but it might mean to sort of deepen what the 1960s experience was in ways in which it might become stranger. Because the problem is that now the New Left has become a sort of like whatever, like a cultural phenomenon that it's like it's very easy to reify what it was. Right?
Maybe
so
one way of thinking about it is pre and post 68.
Yeah. Right. You said 68 was a term.
Pre and post 68, meaning that what's most interesting about the left is actually what came before and what came after.
Right, yeah.
But both are actually eclipsed by 68. And that 68 sort of falsifies both what came before and what came after.
But something that's important about the Harrington interest, talk about, is it Miasma? Is that sorry. That guy, I mean, the thing is like the Harrington scene was the labor scene. They were very different. Like they were a part of the labor bureaucracy. They worked with that scene, the AFL-CIO, etc. The people who went to the workers were the people who wanted to go from below and up, like kick those people out of the labor scene.
Right.
And
So
the thing is that the new people, at least we've had some experience with this, they are the like the DSAs. They're the ones who have relationships with the like bureaucracy of music here, the bureaucracy of some NGOs. They work with them already, and that's why they joined the DSA. They are more of a scene of people who already work for these places. They're not the ethos of like the anarchists, which actually there's a lot of anarchists, like people we know, like who is Brennan from, who's like a IWW person. So he's like very anti-DSA or whatever, because he does this worker thing. But that's very small.
it is very small.
That's not really much of a phenomenon. I think we have more of like people just picking up the pieces as other people are doing.
So here's we deal with it in the syllabus in this way. Byron Rustin, the failure of black separatism, he makes a positive 1970. Right, and so it's very much about the post-68 moment, but he makes a positive reference to the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. That's curious, because of course the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, they are inspired by all sorts of bad stuff, by the Black Panthers, by nihilism, by Marxist humanism, by Julievskaya-esque stuff. But they, of course, are the opposite of where the civil rights movement started and the SDS started. Namely, they're saying, behead the redhead, Reuter, right? And Reuter was the one who, or Ruther, how do you pronounce it? Ruther. I don't know if that's the original pronunciation. Is it Scottish or German? It's German, right? So what would it be in German?
He's American.
Okay. He's the one who sponsored the civil rights movement in the SDS. Right. So, and Harrington, of course. So what's interesting is that what Byron Rustin says is that the Black Power turn is absurd and going to go nowhere. It's going to turn the Democratic Party into a party of guilty white people and abject poor people, which is a rather optimistic prognosis, actually, if you think about it, as if the Democratic Party is a party of poor people. But he said, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, whatever their problems, that points in another direction. Right? So even though that group defined itself as against Rustin and that whole milieu, he still thought, but that's actually the way forward.
Well, it's because his mentor was the labor organizer. What he wanted was to unite the black revolutionary movement and post-civil rights movement to labor. And he started with the head of the...
But also changed labor. It also changed labor. It's not just
out of time.
Okay.
Two more remarks by Cam and Jerzy.
I have a question just about
Well, I mean, like when we're talking about the millennial left, like I imagine we're just mainly talking about the personalities and intellectuals and
The generational sensibility.
okay.
I mean, like Adolf Reed said at our convention, he said, well, you know, he dismissed, this was a few years ago, he dismissed the idea of millennials. He said, well, you know, that's just a demographic defined by advertising. And, you know, there isn't such thing as millennials. But yet there is, obviously.
So what I was going to ask is, like something like Jacobin when it started, which people here remember, I think. Part of what they wanted to do was sort of put the 90s left
to bed.
And I think there was an article called like, you know, forget the Zapatistas or something like that. Probably not that.
So probably
but
close to it.
It sounds like a Bastard headline. But it's interesting because like the 90s left a lot of the issues that they were fascinated by in terms of globalization and these unaccountable international organizations, the preservation of the, you know, diversity of human experience. A lot of these have been taken by the right and are now like winning issues. And there's a certain kind of irony that like the internationalism of a group like the DSA, but also the British Labour left, they're going to be wound up as the defenders of these international organizations under the pretense of, I guess, opposing the right. But what I find curious about that is something like the DSA, like part of its like founding philosophy was that the American left had failed because it was too international. Like in like the Long Detour. Can't remember the author right now. But he like his version of what an American socialist would look like is kind of like Huey Long. Like a kind of uniquely American personality who doesn't have these kind of foreign influences.
Harold Cruz has the same thesis.
Right.
Harold Cruz has the same thesis. There was never an American left.
But you know, that ambivalence about nationalism and internationalism goes back to Stalinism. Because like Stalin on the one hand is nationalist, but there's also kind of
international. Yeah.
So and you have that same issue in terms of like the conception of solidarity. So I think that the New Left was itself from the beginning deeply ambivalent about its relationship to nationalism.
Yeah.
Because it was rooted in support for certain types of nationalism, hostility to others, ambivalence about others. So there was always we were talking about like, or in a different context, about how like the whole Hamilton-Jefferson thing is flipped. So like now Jefferson is the bad guy and Hamilton's the good guy. But it used to be the opposite.
It used to be the exact opposite, but in our lifetime we've lived long enough to see these things change.
Right, but like there was also in the New Left this search for like a good American patriotism or nationalism, and like
the revolution.
Right, and that also goes back to certain strains of Stalinism from the 30s, right?
Yeah, they called their school was the Jefferson School, the Communist Party USA. But I was going to say something about anti-globalization. So if you recall, it was a bone of contention. The 90s anti-globalization movement always begged to differ with that moniker and say that they're not anti, they're alter globalization, another world is possible. Right. And Richard and I went to, didn't we go see Peter Hudis at the Chicago Social Forum? And he gave a paper, Beyond the State and Markets. And I thought, it's an okay paper or whatever. But it also just seemed like this is just nothing, right? Like, it was well attended, stuff was going on, but Richard and I, we were not impressed by the social forum movement, if you will. I guess that's what it was called. But they weren't just anti-globalizers. Although Naomi Klein can look like that, actually. In other words, she's less of an alter than an anti. And she became the poster child for that. And she's Gen X again. She's my age. Same as Ted Cruz.
Well, also they hold ambivalence on NAFTA.
NAFTA, right? So NAFTA, you're for it, you're against it. So Bill Clinton ran against NAFTA, but then supported it, and
Trump is anti-NAFTA.
Yeah, Trump came out
but
of
the
it.
left was anti-NAFTA.
Yeah, so I think that's a good closing question.
Yes.
So one thing that one question that came up when I read the article about the Millennial Left, does declaring it that does it also mean that our natural but only interlocutor is people that are in their early 20s? That's first. Do we stay confined to people, young people? Do we always declare?
Or interlocutor?
What?
Yeah, it's different.
Or interlocutor
Yeah.
speakers?
Well, maybe you can flesh that out with the difference would be, but maybe both. And the other question is.
Well, because we did include young activists in our early activities. We did, and in a way that we certainly did with Occupy, but in the fourth phase we got away from that because there weren't really any activists to include, right? But
in the first phase, Marisa Holmes, Nick
That's
Carter,
yeah.
So let's frame it in terms of recruitment.
we did have young Antifa. Go ahead.
Let's say recruitment or if you want influence.
Students, educating.
Is it?
Who are we educating?
Are we only is it only imaginable for Platypus to address people between 20 and 25, and everything after it's kind of burned?
Yeah, people are lost. And here's a thought that I had that speaks directly to this point. Soon, you guys will be the age I was when Platypus started. Very soon, in 2 years. Would any of you been able to have done what I've done?
Get your shit together, people.
That's what I'm saying, of course. But also, getting back to a point raised by Sebastian, it's sad to say, because I think that Richard and I also have this, we talk about this sometimes. It's not like we want to say, in the 80s the left was a lot more than it is now. But it was, right? But it's a horrible thing to say. In the 80s, it was more substantial, better. The DSA was better in the 80s than it is now.
Well, I think what's really striking in terms of academic leftism is that in terms of theory, postmodern theory, there's discussion about postmodernism, right? There's nothing really
new
that's been from the 21st century.
Yeah, right. In other words, there's no millennial really anything.
Right, so in other words...
There could have been, if there had been.
At the level of, right, so part of the problem is the question of interpreting the present, right? And the ability of anybody, including Platypus, to be able to interpret and theorize the present.
Guys, the pieces getting
Okay.